A haunting question echoes through the void, asking what another would do in their place. The ominous voice continues, pondering the hypothetical collapse of the entire world. Silence falls over the devastated landscape as the weight of the apocalyptic vision lingers. Despair creeps in as the voice questions if such a ruined world can even be saved. A grim alternative is proposed, wondering what would happen if their own body took the burden instead. A sudden, sharp sound abruptly shatters the heavy silence of the dark vision. The scene quickly shifts to a welcoming sign for Himen Island, famously known as the Island of Immortality. Meanwhile, at the Hiroko Shrine, an eager visitor approaches a priest to purchase a fate-binding talisman. Fans scream in delight as the incredibly handsome 27-year-old Tendo Yora confirms their selection. The frantic crowd rejects a new charm, desperately demanding the specific talisman graced by Yora's touch. Overwhelmed admirers praise his sacred appearance while boasting about supporting his online crowdfunding campaigns. Yora calmly confirms his identity as the shrine priest, sending the visitors into another frenzy of excitement. Camera shutters click rapidly as Yora politely assures the crowd their privacy will be respected online. The worshippers celebrate their social media era, praising Yora's divine appearance as a literal national treasure. Observing the chaos, 23-year-old Himori Mikoto internally celebrates leveraging her handsome brother's internet fame. Yora approaches Mikoto directly, curiously asking if she also admires his widely praised appearance. Unfazed, Mikoto dismisses him entirely, bluntly stating her preference leans toward famous and heavily built sumo wrestlers instead. While updating her feed, she admits his face brings vital income to their ancient 1500-year-old shrine. She reflects on their isolated reality, a tiny aging community with severely restricted mainland ferry access. Bearing the weight of the financially ruined village, the heir-daughter reveals plans for donation live streams. Yora looks down hesitantly, questioning if this heavily modernized approach is truly the right path for them. Mikoto softens her tone, reminding him to actually refuse things he dislikes instead of blindly agreeing. She firmly establishes their boundaries as half-siblings, brushing off his deep and unending overprotectiveness. Staring intently, Yora declares he has no dislikes, willing to do absolutely anything to ensure Mikoto remains happy. His expression darkens instantly, threatening violent consequences for any man who dares to approach his beloved sister. Exasperated, Mikoto scolds his extreme sisterly attachment, pointing out it ruins his chances of a normal life. Unrepentant, Yora simply smiles, reaffirming that her well-being surpasses everything else in his entire world. Mikoto sighs in defeat, accepting her brother's unbreakable and somewhat overwhelming dedication to their family bond. A sudden and violent shout shatters the peaceful moment, interrupting Mikoto's demands for even more assistance. The siblings flinch as someone desperately begs for mercy against the mayor's sudden and aggressive outburst nearby. 81-year-old Himori Kingo erupts in fury, vehemently rejecting any mainland bridge development threatening the Forbidden Forest. Outraged by the development plans, Kingo aggressively orders Mikoto to bring purifying salt to banish the foolish intruders. 69-year-old Himori Kigo steps forward, mocking his older brother for clinging to ancient superstitions of an immortal princess. Kigo cold-heartedly reveals the islanders have already consented to the project, urging his furious brother to finally surrender. Mikoto cries out in alarm as her grandfather trembles with unstoppable and absolute righteous indignation. Kigo defends the construction as a necessary safety measure against incoming earthquakes, questioning Kingo's stubborn resistance. Refusing to listen to reason, Kingo completely ignores the logical arguments and blindly yells at them to leave. Mikoto desperately questions their bitter sibling rivalry, only to hear Kingo dismiss his brother as an arrogant fool. Frustrated by the absolute chaos, Mikoto snaps back, pointing out her grandfather is the truly stubborn one. The intense argument cools as Mikoto seriously questions if her grandfather truly believes the dreaded immortal princess curse. The story plunges into a mysterious void as dark whispers begin to surface. Ominous rumors circulate about a wicked immortal princess who was permanently sealed upon this isolated island. Seeking eternal beauty, the princess supposedly drank a mythical elixir to become forever ageless. As brutal punishment for her sins, she transformed into a monstrous creature and was locked away. Frightening legends claim she still lurks deep within the vast cavern system beneath the ancient forest. Anyone foolish enough to approach the forbidden territory faces the lethal wrath of her dark power. To contain this horrifying threat, the Himori family fiercely guarded the forbidden forest for countless generations. Ignoring the serious history, Kingo belligerently yells about television subtitles while stubbornly defending the forest. Kigo presses the grim reality that all proper medical facilities exist solely on the distant mainland. He passionately argues that constructing a massive bridge would finally solve their dangerous geographic isolation. A bridge would guarantee swift access to mainland hospitals during sudden attacks or dire medical emergencies. Kigo insists the bridge will boost vital medical funds, but Kingo foolishly prioritizes his internet connection. Recalling a past near-death experience, Kigo highlights the terrifying reality of their complete island isolation. He vividly remembers a childhood injury where rough seas nearly prevented him from getting urgent medical help. Completely changing the subject to television dramas, Kingo stubbornly ends the conversation while Mikoto watches helplessly. Exhausted by the fierce argument, Mikoto sighs heavily as the tense family dispute suddenly ends. Infuriated by the blatant disrespect, Kigo storms off while aggressively cursing his older brother's immense stubbornness. Despite the confrontation, Mikoto realizes the bridge construction remains permanently stalled without her grandfather's official approval. Knowing her uncle's aggressive efforts failed, she accepts that she alone must persuade the stubborn elder. Kigo's frustration echoes loudly as he complains about dangerous paths and prioritizing silly myths over lives. An official confidently guides a large group of town hall workers toward a heavily restricted area. They deliberately march toward a prominent warning sign that strictly forbids entry into the sacred forest. Spotting the town hall uniforms, Mikoto recognizes her rebellious uncle leading the unauthorized expedition. She watches in absolute horror as the determined group prepares to cross the ancient sacred boundary. Defying centuries of strict tradition, the government officials casually step past the protective barrier. Panic violently sets in as Mikoto realizes they are willingly trespassing into the dangerous forbidden land. Abandoning her clueless grandfather to his games, Mikoto desperately tries to rally Yora into action. Knowing time is critical, she frantically urges her brother to help chase down the trespassing officials. Without a moment of hesitation, the two siblings sprint directly into the dense and shadowy woods. The towering ancient trees quickly swallow them whole as they aggressively venture deeper into the unknown. Sprinting through the dense undergrowth, Mikoto silently begs her grandfather for forgiveness for breaking the rules. A sudden and incredibly oppressive atmosphere heavily descends upon the rushing siblings without any warning. Mikoto abruptly freezes in her tracks as a strange sensation violently washes over her entire body. Gasping for breath, she desperately questions the bizarre and overwhelming energy permeating the sacred woods. She struggles to identify if her deep dread stems from breaking the taboo or fearing the curse. Pushing past her initial fear, a completely unexpected and confusing emotion slowly begins to surface. Inexplicably, the deeply forbidden and highly dangerous woods suddenly fill her with a profound sense of nostalgia. Breaking her deep spiritual trance, her uncle's confused voice suddenly rings out through the ancient trees. Confronting the trespassers, Mikoto angrily scolds her uncle for moving forward without her grandfather's permission. He coldly justifies his blatant trespassing by prioritizing the citizens' ultimate safety over ancient sacred duties. Observing the town hall officials, Mikoto solemnly notes her grandfather's increasing need for medication. Dismissing the curse entirely, Kigo gestures broadly and reminds Mikoto that she once supported the construction. He stubbornly insists their foolish older brother will eventually accept and appreciate the completed bridge. Suddenly, a strange and unsettling shape materializes overhead, prompting immediate confusion among the group. The sky rapidly darkens as massive, erratic flocks of birds begin to swarm chaotically above. The unnatural avian migration continues to intensify, casting eerie shadows over the bewildered onlookers below. Horrified by the disgusting spectacle, they question why every single bird has suddenly taken flight. A deep and ominous rumbling abruptly shakes the very foundation of the sacred ancient grounds. Deafening alarms instantly blare out emergency warnings for an incoming catastrophic earthquake. Frantic shouts order an immediate halt to all work as phones flash a seismic intensity alert. The urgent digital warnings repeat continuously, echoing a terrifying promise of extreme and violent tremors. The ground violently bucks beneath their feet, shattering the previously tense and heavy stillness. Massive trees sway dangerously as the relentless seismic waves tear mercilessly through the forbidden landscape. The officials completely lose their footing, stumbling helplessly against the overwhelming force of the moving earth. Desperate cries of terror fill the air as the islanders struggle to survive the brutal quaking. Screaming in sheer panic, they wildly question the impossible and terrifying magnitude of the disaster. Someone shrieks in absolute horror, realizing they have never witnessed an earthquake of such destructive scale. Dread washes over them as they realize this might be the legendary Great Earthquake everyone feared. Kigo stares in paralyzed shock as the sacred forest violently crumbles and collapses around him. Breathless and utterly terrified, Mikoto gasps as the catastrophic destruction unfolds before her wide eyes. The unstable earth suddenly fractures violently, revealing a massive and terrifying chasm opening beneath them. Clouds of thick dust rapidly swallow the chaotic scene as the ancient ground gives way completely. Caught in a disorienting blur of motion, Mikoto finds herself entirely unable to comprehend the devastation. Yura screams her name just as she realizes the massive underground cave system has completely collapsed. Staring into the deep, terrifying darkness of the ruins, she chillingly senses someone watching her. A morning news broadcast urgently reports a massive 8.4 magnitude earthquake striking off the coast of Prefecture Z. Chaos erupts at a local hospital as medical staff urgently direct patients with green tags to a nearby school. Amidst the frantic triage process, overwhelmed nurses desperately try to identify incoming victims lacking identification cards. Panicked rescuers rush a young girl into the emergency room, screaming for a doctor to treat her severe landslide injuries. A brave islander named Jean risked a terrifying tsunami to sail her across the dangerous waters, refusing to let Kingo's granddaughter die. The frantic medical team swiftly commands the rescuers to bring the unconscious girl deeper into the crowded medical facility. Suddenly, shocked bystanders spot the disoriented mayor stumbling through the hectic medical camp. Deeply confused and entirely dazed, the bewildered mayor is gently guided toward a medical tent. Slowly regaining consciousness in a strange bed, Mikoto shockingly realizes she has been transported to a mainland hospital. Her grandfather urgently pushes past the medical staff, desperately calling out to check if she can hear him. With a defeated and heavy expression, he cryptically warns her that she is the only one who can handle the impending disaster. Utterly confused by his dark words, Mikoto questions what he means about her connection to the isolated island. Staring intently with deep sorrow, her weary grandfather begs her to listen closely to his next terrifying words. The heavy conversation hangs thickly in the air as chaos continues swirling around their designated yellow triage area. Leaning in closely, he completely shatters her reality by confessing that the cursed immortal princess is completely real. A chilling silence violently washes over Mikoto as the terrifying truth of the ancient legend finally sets in. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the weary grandfather tells Mikoto that she is the only one who can solve this crisis. He stares at her intently and asks if she truly understands the heavy burden being placed upon her shoulders. Mikoto listens in stunned silence as the weight of her grandfather's ominous warning slowly sinks in. Breaking the heavy tension, he reveals the chilling truth that the cursed immortal princess is actually still alive. The terrifying revelation fades away as Mikoto slowly regains consciousness in a completely unfamiliar environment. Groggily opening her eyes, she looks around the strange room and wonders exactly where she has been taken. Confusion sets in as she tries to comprehend why she was abandoned in such an unknown and deserted place. Getting out of bed, she cautiously surveys the eerily quiet surroundings for any signs of life. Glancing around the room, she realizes she is somehow inside a mainland junior high school instead of a medical facility. Her fragmented memories slowly begin to piece themselves back together as she recalls the recent catastrophic events. She remembers being caught in the massive earthquake back in the restricted zone and needing transport to a mainland hospital. The specific name of Matsuki Memorial Hospital finally surfaces in her recovering memory. Noticing her phone and personal belongings are missing, she wonders why she woke up in a school instead of the hospital. Feeling incredibly disoriented, she questions how long she has been unconscious while deciding to look for a restroom. Walking down the empty hall, she spots a deserted emergency water station displaying a 1 bottle per person sign. Hoping to find a rescue worker or doctor, she calls out loudly into the silent corridors. Her voice merely echoes through the completely abandoned school building without drawing a single response. The oppressive silence deepens as she continues wandering through the desolate and empty facility. Frustration and fear begin to mount as she wonders why there is absolutely nobody left in the building. Spotting a nearby street sign, she anxiously questions where all the local residents could have possibly disappeared to. Trying to stay calm, she rationalizes that the massive earthquake must have triggered a mandatory mass evacuation. She desperately hopes that her grandfather and Yora were safely evacuated to a secure location along with everyone else. Suddenly, a fleeting glimpse of movement in the distance abruptly catches her desperate attention. Believing she finally spotted another survivor, she urgently calls out and begs them to stop. She immediately breaks into a sprint, screaming for the mysterious person to wait for her. Skidding to a halt, she gasps in absolute horror at the terrifying scene unfolding before her eyes. The once bustling mainland street now lies completely devastated and choked with apocalyptic ruins. Staring at the massive destruction, she struggles to breathe as she questions the impossible nightmare surrounding her. Ash and debris coat the shattered remains of the entire devastated city landscape. The overwhelming scale of the horrific disaster leaves her utterly paralyzed with sheer dread. A sudden and sharp electronic ringtone violently shatters the dead silence of the ruined city. Tracking the familiar digital sound, she quickly determines it is coming from the third floor of a nearby building. Cautiously approaching the source of the noise, she nervously navigates through the darkened and dangerous wreckage. Spotting a figure in the shadows, she excitedly yells out to them in desperate relief. Overwhelmed with gratitude, she begs the stranger to finally explain exactly what happened to the destroyed city. Mikoto desperately introduces herself as being from Himen Island, begging the strangers to help contact her family. She suddenly pauses in deep confusion as she gets a much closer look at them. Staring in absolute shock, she hesitates and questions who these strange people really are. A deep sense of dread washes over her as she tries to comprehend their terrifying actions. The monstrous figures loom menacingly in the dark shadows of the ruined building. The gruesome scene slowly comes into full, horrifying focus before her wide eyes. One of the nightmarish figures violently attacks something completely unidentifiable on the cold ground. Absolute chaos and horror fill the dark corridor as the monstrous reality fully sets in. She screams in absolute horror upon realizing the monsters are violently attacking other human survivors. Trembling in sheer terror, she loudly questions what this impossible nightmare could possibly be. Panic completely takes over as she desperately tries to understand the chaotic and terrifying situation. The monstrous creatures suddenly stop their attack and slowly turn their terrifying attention directly toward her. One of the terrifying beings begins to aggressively charge down the blood-stained hallway toward her. Cursing in sheer disbelief, she turns and wildly flees from the rapidly approaching nightmare. Sprinting frantically, she desperately follows the emergency signs pointing directly toward the rooftop access doors. Bursting through the heavy metal doors, she screams as she bursts out onto the high rooftop. Cornered and absolutely terrified, she begs loudly for anyone to come and save her life. Falling to her knees, she desperately pleads for a miracle against the approaching monstrous threats. The terrifying creature violently smashes through the rooftop door with immense and brutal physical force. It slowly steps out into the light, fully revealing its truly horrifying and mutated form. The monster aggressively lunges forward, determined to make the terrified girl its next helpless victim. Suddenly, a massive blur of motion violently intercepts the attacking creature in midair. Shocked by the sudden intervention, Mikoto weakly questions the bizarre and violent turn of events. Staring at the unbelievable carnage, she wonders if she is trapped inside a terrible dream. She tries to convince herself that an apocalyptic nightmare like this is completely impossible. Her mind violently rejects the terrifying reality of a world completely overrun by vicious monsters. Clutching her head, she loudly insists that this horrifying existence simply cannot be real. The mysterious savior stands victorious amidst the absolute destruction on the ruined rooftop. Trembling violently, she decides that this entire horrific ordeal is just a horrible nightmare. She desperately wishes she could finally wake up and escape the absolute madness surrounding her. The dark figure slowly turns around, revealing a highly imposing and dangerous physical presence. The savior steps closer, their massive weapon heavily dripping from the brutal and violent execution. The menacing figure stares silently at the completely terrified girl cowering on the concrete floor. A deep, authoritative voice suddenly cuts through the silence, surprised to find one survivor alive. The mysterious warrior completely towers over Mikoto, waiting for her next desperate move. Mikoto gasps in pure disbelief as the imposing figure speaks aloud. The mysterious warrior abruptly turns toward the chaotic noise echoing through the ruined streets. Realizing her savior is actually human, she freezes before he urgently commands her to run. He strictly warns her that the loud commotion will quickly attract more terrifying creatures. They desperately dash past the shattered remains of Matsuki Memorial Hospital. A sudden jolt of recognition strikes her as they pass the ruined medical facility. Horrifying monsters begin swarming the chaotic area behind them in rapid pursuit. The fierce warrior orders her to keep moving, bluntly stating that a bite means certain death. Together they sprint through the crumbling debris to escape the rapidly advancing nightmare. Overwhelmed by absolute madness, she completely fails to process the sudden monstrous invasion. Her mind struggles to accept the brutal reality of this stranger effortlessly slaughtering the beasts. Completely exhausted and thoroughly confused, she admits she can no longer handle the terrifying situation. Suddenly, her severe injuries violently flare up and cause her to stumble heavily. Searing pain from the devastating cave collapse violently courses through her weakened body. The warrior shouts loudly in alarm as she collapses toward the hard concrete. He quickly rushes back and urgently grabs her before the approaching monsters can strike. Scooping her up, he aggressively sprints away from the deadly and pursuing horde. He expertly navigates the ruined streets while carrying her safely through the destruction. Spotting an abandoned building, he quickly ducks inside to escape the chaotic massacre outside. She stammers nervously as he forcefully pushes her inside the ruined Yorozu real estate office. He swiftly secures the shattered doors to block any terrifying creatures from entering their sanctuary. The warrior groans heavily from the intense physical exhaustion of their desperate escape. Catching his breath, he finally turns his intense gaze directly toward the rescued girl. They wait silently in the dim and dusty shadows of the destroyed real estate office. He leans in closer to carefully inspect the exhausted survivor he just risked everything to save. Visibly disappointed, he bluntly complains that he risked his life for a mere brat. Setting his frustration aside, he suspiciously questions what she was doing alone in the dangerous ruins. The fierce warrior aggressively glares down at the confused girl, loudly demanding to know what she was doing out there alone in the ruins. He violently points a harsh finger directly at her face, aggressively trying to intimidate the frightened and completely disoriented survivor. Startled by his incredibly loud voice, Mikoto suddenly realizes that this aggressive and intimidating young man is actually the one who saved her. She stares up at the highly imposing young man in complete disbelief, struggling to process his intensely harsh and entirely unwelcoming attitude. He roughly pinches her cheeks in deep frustration, angrily scolding her for foolishly ignoring the very loud and clear public warnings. He aggressively demands to know if she somehow missed the mandatory mass evacuation order that was given a while ago. He heavily complains about her incredibly loud screaming, cruelly mocking her desperate cries for help as highly suicidal behavior. Flicking her forehead hard, he harshly mocks her traditional shrine outfit as a completely ridiculous and highly inappropriate Halloween costume. She angrily pulls away and fiercely defends her traditional shrine attire while aggressively questioning his incredibly rude and abrasive behavior. She immediately regrets ever thinking this highly abrasive and arrogant stranger was a reliable or trustworthy savior in this chaotic nightmare. Her brief admiration entirely vanishes as he cruelly mocks her terrible luck for needing someone as difficult as him for a rescue. Shockingly, the aggressive and unpredictable warrior suddenly begins unzipping his heavy tactical uniform top right in front of her. He slowly and deliberately pulls his strong arms entirely free from the confines of his heavy tactical military jacket. Mikoto panics wildly as the incredibly strange man begins removing his upper garments in the highly enclosed and completely isolated space. He arrogantly claims he can only truly relax without his heavy shirt, boldly urging her to thoroughly admire his incredibly impressive physique. Deeply disgusted, she violently screams at the shameless creep to put his clothes back on immediately before things get worse. She desperately yells for him to stop his highly inappropriate behavior, declaring she has absolutely no desire to see a shirtless man. He coldly dismisses her as being completely unappealing and far too young, making an inappropriate joke about vastly preferring highly mature women. Utterly horrified by his terrible attitude, she aggressively asks if this deeply bizarre and incredibly rude man is actually from the self-defense forces. Smirking darkly, he bitterly notes that official titles mean absolutely nothing in their current chaotic and highly apocalyptic situation. She stares at him in absolute silence, completely unable to process his incredibly cynical and entirely broken worldview right now. Highly frustrated and completely exhausted, she desperately questions the absolute madness currently unfolding around them in the destroyed city. She aggressively yells that his bizarre personal habits and highly strange preferences are absolutely none of her concern at all. She desperately demands to know where everyone went and exactly why terrifying monsters now violently roam the completely destroyed streets. She frantically questions how the entire surrounding city completely collapsed into such a terrifying and highly absolute chaotic nightmare so quickly. A horrifying creature suddenly slams hard against the glass door, causing her to violently scream in pure and absolute terror. He calmly reassures her that the mindless mutated beasts have entirely forgotten exactly how to open simple doors anymore. Casually dusting off an old radio, he bluntly remarks that she truly knows absolutely nothing about the massive disaster outside. The crackling emergency broadcast confirms the desperate government officially declared a massive state of national emergency entirely across the country. The radio desperately details massive violent riots and spreading terrifying monsters immediately following a huge earthquake 3 exact days ago. She gasps in sheer absolute terror, chillingly realizing she has been entirely unconscious and helpless for 3 whole terrifying days. The desperate broadcast explains the infected victims violently transformed into horrific beasts and must be strictly and completely avoided forever. The cynical man openly scoffs at the completely useless government orders telling terrified citizens to securely shelter in their homes. He grimly reveals the absolute worst monster outbreaks tragically happened directly inside the highly crowded and completely unprotected evacuation centers. Rampant terrifying infections entirely destroyed all organized and secure rescue efforts completely across the massively ruined and totally devastated country. He bitterly and openly admits the failing state has completely and totally abandoned him and all remaining military defense forces. He chillingly and calmly predicts the entire vast nation of Japan will completely and utterly collapse within a single month. Staring entirely blankly into the shadows, he bluntly and firmly declares it is the absolute and terrifying end of the world. Mikoto completely freezes in place, utterly paralyzed and entirely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the terrifying apocalyptic truth. She silently and desperately prays her beloved grandfather and older brother somehow survive this highly sudden and completely violent hellscape. His dark tone suddenly sharpens incredibly as he aggressively and highly suspiciously asks if she was secretly bitten and infected. He forcefully grabs her head with immense strength, intensely and thoroughly searching her entire body for any hidden deadly bite marks. Deeply confused and highly terrified, she nervously stammers while frantically trying to process his incredibly dark and highly aggressive accusation. A sudden and highly intense wave of horrifying realization abruptly washes completely over her trembling and entirely exhausted fragile body. Desperately hiding her sudden rising panic, she blatantly lies and quickly blames her extreme dizziness entirely on the heavy toxic smoke. Clearly remembering his earlier severe warning, she nervously and desperately insists she is completely unharmed and entirely free of any bites. She chillingly realizes a single simple bite entirely spreads the terrifying infection and violently creates those incredibly horrific roaming monsters. She rapidly averts her terrified eyes, sweating nervously under his incredibly intense, highly penetrating, and entirely deeply suspicious dark glare. He finally releases her trembling body, calmly noting that dangerous bites entirely farther from the brain consistently show violent symptoms much slower. Quietly sitting deep in the dark shadows, he calmly promises to leave entirely once the terrifying monsters finally disperse outside. Slumping heavily against the shattered glass, the injured warrior grimly promises to share all his remaining knowledge before the end. Startled by a sudden frantic movement in the room, he weakly calls out as the young girl abruptly dashes away. Watching her in exhausted confusion, he urgently demands to know what she is trying to accomplish with the scattered medical kits. Completely ignoring his loud protests, she frantically tears through the emergency boxes in a desperate search for any useful supplies. He weakly warns her that common medicines are useless since previous medical tests already proved them entirely ineffective against the infection. Grabbing her arm tightly, he strictly orders her to stop wasting precious medical supplies since they are now incredibly rare treasures. Pushing his weakened hand away forcefully, she fiercely clutches the medical supplies and refuses to give up on finding a viable cure. She passionately insists they must try every possible treatment, desperately hoping there is still enough time to save his fading life. Trembling with overwhelming anxiety, she completely refuses to accept that his grim fate is sealed without any possible method of salvation remaining. Despite hearing his detailed explanations, she feels completely trapped inside a highly terrifying and inescapable nightmare that defies all logic. Smiling sadly at her desperate panic, He gently asks her to stop making such a tragically sorrowful expression for his sake. He entirely accepts his impending doom, gazing up at the ceiling while quietly preparing himself for the terrifying and inevitable transformation. He bravely reassures her that protecting helpless civilians is his sworn duty, entirely willing to face the horrific fate of becoming a monster. Confidently smiling through the intense pain, he proudly declares he was always prepared to sacrifice himself for a much greater cause. Calmly accepting his incredibly tragic destiny, he fully believes that sacrificing his life to save an innocent girl is a highly noble end. Frustrated by her relentless medical attempts, he forcefully tells her to sit down while she tearfully begs for a miraculous solution. He aggressively orders her to back away immediately, utilizing harsh warnings to maintain distance and strictly protect her from his impending monstrous turn. Refusing to stand idly by, she angrily rejects his fatalistic attitude and fiercely insists there must be some way to stop the infection. She steps closer toward his deeply wounded form, entirely driven by a highly mysterious and completely unexplainable surge of hidden internal energy. A profoundly strange and overwhelming sensation abruptly washes over her trembling body, entirely changing her frantic demeanor into something far calmer. He bitterly states that humanity was always doomed, gently assuring her that her highly compassionate tears are more than enough for him. Accepting his final moments, he softly urges her to focus entirely on her own future survival instead of grieving his impending demise. Startled by her sudden confident advance, he nervously stammers as she aggressively moves far closer than he ever safely allowed before. She leans in incredibly closely, completely ignoring his panicked warnings while an intense and deeply mysterious aura fully engulfs her determined presence. Utterly shocked by her drastic transformation, he silently questions why her entire atmosphere suddenly changed from pure panic to absolute terrifying confidence. Moving purely on incredibly strong instinct, she admits entirely to herself that she completely understands the highly dangerous actions she must undertake. Driven by an ancient power, she confidently prepares to channel her mysterious hidden energy directly to heal the heavily wounded warrior. She firmly places her glowing hands upon him, initiating a highly powerful mystical energy transfer to violently purge the deadly viral infection. A brilliantly blinding flash of highly mysterious spiritual light suddenly erupts between them, rapidly pushing back the encroaching and terrifying dark shadows. The intense and deeply magical energy entirely consumes the ruined room, deeply shocking the heavily injured soldier with its incredibly miraculous power. Gasping heavily for air, Mikoto suddenly breaks the intense spiritual connection, leaving them both completely breathless and deeply overwhelmed by the mystical event. Looking around the highly devastated room, she chillingly confirms that this terrifying apocalyptic disaster is absolutely not just a terrible dream. A familiar deep voice suddenly echoes through the dusty ruins, casually noting that she has finally awakened from her highly exhausted slumber. She turns around in absolute shock, staring entirely wide-eyed at the fully recovered warrior standing confidently amidst the scattered and broken debris. The rugged soldier flexes his heavily scarred arm, completely free of any horrific monstrous symptoms or deadly viral infections that previously threatened him. Mikoto gapes in pure and absolute disbelief, loudly noticing that the deep and terrifying monstrous bite marks have entirely vanished from his skin. Staring intensely at his miraculously healed flesh, the highly bewildered warrior aggressively demands to know exactly what she did to his infected body. She stammers in extreme confusion, desperately trying to comprehend why he somehow completely avoided transforming into a horrific and highly dangerous raging beast. He grimly states that nobody has ever survived a bite, entirely convinced she somehow used a highly mysterious power to miraculously save him. Leaning in with an incredibly intense and deeply suspicious glare, he firmly changes his direct questioning tactic to uncover her highly guarded secrets. Towering over her trembling form, he bluntly and forcefully demands to know who she truly is beneath her completely ordinary and helpless facade. A sudden, piercing scream shatters the silence as she stares in absolute shock. Panic sets in as she notices a mysterious, lingering mark on her skin. Startled by the commotion, a figure demands to know the reason for her frantic shouting. She furiously orders the intruder out of her makeshift living space behind the shop, completely ignoring his warnings about the dangerous stove. He calmly dismisses her outrage, reminding her that he already witnessed her entirely fragile state the day before. Shouting insults at the rude soldier, she is quickly shut down when he bluntly states she isn't his type anyway. Correcting her firmly, Sergeant First Class Kurosaki Tatsumi demands she address him properly. Tatsumi muses aloud about how remarkably different and intense she acted during their previous encounter. Vivid memories of her deep connection with the imposing man yesterday flash through her mind. She silently agrees with his assessment, realizing her past behavior felt entirely out of character. Overwhelmed by the chaotic memories, she frantically shakes her head and refuses to dwell on the confusing events. Her anxiety mounts as she worries for her missing family in a world now overrun by monstrous creatures known as Hidorugami. Emerging from her thoughts, she wonders if she can convince Tatsumi to safely escort her back to her island home. Before she can even ask, Tatsumi completely takes charge and abruptly orders her to move. Confused by his strict command, she listens as he theorizes that his miraculous recovery is directly tied to her presence. Tatsumi reveals his official orders to transfer her as the central key to stopping the monstrous pandemic. Staring her down, he firmly crushes any hope that he might be talking about someone else. Desperate to escape this massive burden, she insists she is just an ordinary shrine maiden without any supernatural abilities to save anyone. She tries to attribute his healing to his own strong immunity, vividly recalling the horrific memory of her twin brother getting bitten. Tatsumi shatters her argument by pointing out that natural immunity failed to save her own brother from turning into a beast. A heavy, somber silence falls as they both acknowledge the devastating loss of their families to the unstoppable infection. Tatsumi recounts grim tales of infected mothers and loyal soldiers turning on the very loved ones they desperately tried to protect. Undeterred by her deep fear, he declares it his absolute military duty to escort her to a specialized research facility. Leaning in with an intimidating glare, he questions her stubborn refusal to grasp the severity of the crisis. He delivers the crushing ultimatum that the survival of the entire nation rests squarely on her shoulders. She freezes completely, thoroughly overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of his monumental declaration. Stripping away her choices, he coldly states that the nation's rapid collapse leaves no room for her personal feelings. Desperate for a quick escape route, she awkwardly interrupts his intense speech to ask for a bathroom break. Annoyed by the mundane interruption, Tatsumi harshly grants her permission to step away. Safely behind a closed door, she clutches her head in absolute disbelief at how rapidly the situation escalated. Pacing frantically in the small space, she completely rejects the absurd notion that a normal girl like her could save a whole country. Outraged that her own consent was entirely ignored, she furiously questions the madness of his strict military demands. Steeling her resolve, she quickly decides on her own immediate, defiant course of action. Meanwhile, Tatsumi bangs loudly on the door, his patience wearing dangerously thin as the minutes tick by. Suspicion rapidly creeps into his mind as the prolonged silence from the bathroom raises serious red flags. Losing all remaining patience, he firmly warns her that he is coming in regardless of her protests. With a sudden, powerful kick, Tatsumi brutally smashes the wooden door wide open. He bursts aggressively into the small room, fully expecting to find her cowering inside. To his utter shock, he finds the bathroom completely empty, with only an open window letting in the ocean breeze. Gritting his teeth in furious realization, he curses her sudden and incredibly daring escape. Outside, Mikoto sprints desperately through the deserted streets, aiming to put as much distance between them as possible. She navigates the ruined coastal landscape, her heart pounding as she focuses entirely on reaching her destination. Mentally apologizing for her sudden betrayal, she prioritizes her grandfather's immediate safety over the fate of the entire nation. A brief wave of guilt washes over her for leaving her reluctant savior behind without a proper farewell. She reflects sadly that in a peaceful world, they might have actually formed a genuine friendship. Reaching the docks, she quickly boards a small vessel and relies entirely on her island upbringing to operate the machinery. The old engine sputters and finally roars to life as she firmly grabs the steering wheel. Suddenly, a powerful hand clamps down viciously on the edge of the boat, halting her daring escape. Tatsumi hauls himself aboard, warning her that her reckless actions could easily get them both killed by roaming monsters. Cornered once again, she screams in fierce frustration, demanding he stop forcing a messianic destiny onto her normal life. She fiercely defends her narrow focus, insisting that saving her family is the absolute only mission she can physically handle. Gripping the wheel tightly, she stubbornly repeats her vow to return home immediately no matter the cost. Ignoring her protests, Tatsumi suddenly sways, a dark and terrible shadow crossing his previously stoic face. Without warning, the formidable soldier loses his perfect balance and heavily collapses onto the wooden deck. Panicking as his massive weight abruptly pins her down, she struggles frantically to push him off. Tatsumi curses under his breath, his broad chest heaving as an unnatural, draining weakness overtakes his body. Thoroughly alarmed by his sudden physical deterioration, Mikoto frantically tries to assess his rapidly fading condition. She violently grabs his arm, noticing something deeply wrong and sinister creeping across his skin. Absolute horror dawns on her as she realizes his miraculous recovery might have only been temporary. Tatsumi echoes her deep dread, staring in complete disbelief at his own failing, infected body. She cries out his name in sheer panic as the terrifying reality of his returning infection sets in. Touching his skin, she violently recoils from his scorching fever and the sinister, spreading markings on his flesh. Desperately clinging to his uniform, she begs him to stay conscious as the demonic transformation aggressively accelerates. Tatsumi writhes in sheer agony, fighting a brutal, losing battle against the vicious infection ravaging his veins. Meanwhile, their small motorized boat drifts aimlessly on the quiet, isolating waters of the vast open sea. The tranquil ocean provides a stark, hauntingly beautiful contrast to the violent struggle happening aboard the vessel. Staring at the calm water, Tatsumi deduces they are temporarily safe from the mindless monsters, bitterly cursing his grim fate. He questions the strange, prolonged delay in his transformation, realizing he survived much longer than any normal victim ever could. As the cursed tattoos spread rapidly across his flesh, he forces a pained smirk and desperately tries to maintain his trademark bravado. His false confidence ultimately shatters, leaving him to grimly accept the dark inevitability of his monstrous fate. Coughing weakly, he admits his massive tactical error in blindly believing her presence alone was a permanent cure. Refusing to accept his quick surrender, Mikoto stares at him with a fiery, unyielding determination shining in her eyes. She aggressively scolds the hardened soldier for abandoning hope when they both know there might still be a viable solution. Furious at his perceived selfishness, she loudly reminds him that her own survival depends entirely on him fighting the vicious infection. Channeling her fierce desire to boldly protect him, she demands he swallow his immense pride and explicitly beg for her help. Realizing their previous, deeply intense connection was the true catalyst for his healing, she bravely braces herself for what must be done. Pushing past her deep embarrassment, she loudly suggests they share their powerful healing bond once again to purge the spreading venom. Instantly blushing furiously, she mentally berates herself for blurting out such a bold and incredibly intimate proposition. Mortified by her own completely uncharacteristic bravery, she trembles violently at the mere thought of taking the physical lead. As he weakly leans his heavy frame against her, panic floods her mind as she realizes she has absolutely no idea how to actually proceed. Sensing her deep hesitation, Tatsumi summons the absolute last of his failing strength to pull her tight against his burning chest. She gasps in genuine surprise as his sudden, commanding physical grip shatters all of her lingering, fearful doubts. With a very dangerous glint in his feverish eyes, he boldly challenges her to definitively prove her shaky resolve. The overwhelming, magnetic intensity of his deep gaze sends a powerful shockwave straight to her very core. Yielding to the desperate situation, they fully embrace, letting their profound emotional and physical connection ignite the magical healing process. Breathing heavily against her neck, he playfully mocks the stark difference between her previous wild aggression and her current timidity. He marvels aloud at her chaotic nature, finding a strange, warm comfort in her utter unpredictability during this crisis. A soft, incredibly genuine smile breaks through his immense agony as he completely surrenders to her miraculous healing touch. Reclaiming his natural protective nature, he gently apologizes for his harshness and promises to take over from here to save them both. As they sink into the restorative embrace, she realizes that despite the confusing blur of yesterday, her purpose today is crystal clear. As the mysterious healing energy flows, Mikoto realizes that a deeply familiar and overwhelming sensation is rapidly returning. The profound mystical connection deepens silently, enveloping them both in a warm, restorative light that actively fights the infection. They remain locked in their desperate embrace as the powerful spiritual bond works rapidly to purge the dark venom. Breaking the intense connection with a heavy gasp, Tatsumi stares down and confidently declares his theory is absolutely certain. Noting his vanished markings, he realizes his complicated body's state and firmly suspects she is far beyond ordinary. He bluntly concludes that unless they regularly share their deeply mystical bond, he will terrifyingly transform into a monster. Utterly shocked by this heavy burden, she frantically demands to know the exact magical principle causing this bizarre phenomenon. As he inappropriately tries to investigate her healing antibodies, she furiously screams and rapidly scrambles to fix her clothes. A sudden, unexpected noise abruptly interrupts their chaotic argument, drawing their startled attention directly toward the distant shoreline. Staring out across the water in absolute disbelief, Mikoto gasps loudly as she suddenly spots the silhouette of Yora. The survivors lament that returning to the temple is no longer easy, as the town has become a dangerous den of monsters. They discuss how the terrified survivors who managed to escape the carnage. Those lucky few have all desperately gathered here now for safety. A voice excitedly announces that Yora has returned, and Mikoto is with him. Overjoyed, a woman confirms Yora found her, relieved that Mikoto is finally safe. Mikoto happily greets Naomi and Uncle Fujiki, thankful that everyone made it out unharmed. Yora humbly downplays his effort, mentioning he simply happened to accompany the needed supplies. An older woman curiously points out Tatsumi, asking who the young man is. Believing Tatsumi is from the self-defense forces, the group cheers, assuming a rescue team has finally arrived. Tatsumi professionally reassures them that government agencies are coordinating widespread life-saving operations to reach this district. However, he warns that the wide scope of damage requires their patience as the rescue will take some time. Mikoto silently fumes at his polite lie, noting how differently he treats them compared to his earlier bluntness with her. Tatsumi smoothly insists that his statement about the impending rescue isn't actually a lie. He privately tells Mikoto that if she uses her power to end the plague, a true rescue will eventually be possible. Hearing his confidence, Mikoto wonders if she really possesses the power to bring about such a miraculous rescue. The group gossips about the Tanaka family's daughter fleeing from Tokyo, worrying that limited food and space will cause issues. Suspicion quickly mounts as the group aggressively demands proof that the outsiders aren't infected. A desperate mother screams that her child is perfectly fine, begging the angry crowd to listen. She fiercely insists she examined him herself and checked his whole body for any signs of infection. Trembling, she loudly declares that he is absolutely not infected at all. A skeptical man points out the child looks to be in pain, arguing that even one infected person will doom them all. The crowd ruthlessly reminds her of their agreement: whoever gets bitten must be eliminated immediately, no matter who they are. As the mother wails, a man demands she show the child to everyone to prove his innocence. A sudden disturbance causes the terrified mother to gasp as the situation escalates. The crowd erupts in panic, shouting that there is an infected person among them. Tatsumi orders Mikoto back, noting the infected person bears the same distinct markings he once had. Seeing the marks, Mikoto hesitates, wondering if she really has the power to heal the infected victim. Tatsumi coldly warns her that presenting such information incorrectly will only cause a massive panic. As the mob ruthlessly calls for the infected person's death, Tatsumi grimly notes it is already too late. The crowd violently surges forward, screaming to kill the monster before it attacks. A horrifying, agonizing transformation suddenly begins to take hold of the infected individual. A blood-curdling roar echoes as the tragic transformation reaches its terrifying climax. Mikoto watches in horror, questioning if this is the final, monstrous transformation into a Hidorugami. The devastating reality sets in as a sibling watches their loved one succumb entirely to the virus. A despairing cry rings out for the lost sister as the monster fully emerges. The survivors stand in stunned, terrified silence, unable to process the rapid and brutal transformation. A man tries to calm the group, noting the monster is gone, but the horrifying reality of the transformation lingers. The older survivors bitterly blame the younger generation, accusing the Tanaka daughter of bringing misfortune upon them. Disgusted by their cruel paranoia, Mikoto wonders who the real monsters truly are in this situation. An older man suspiciously turns his attention, deciding they must physically check the newcomers as well. He politely but firmly asks to inspect Mikoto and the young man to ensure they aren't hiding bites. The demand hangs heavily in the air as the paranoid survivors wait for compliance. He repeats his request, asking to see both of their bodies for absolute certainty. Mikoto freezes in pure panic, completely unsure of how to navigate this sudden, dangerous inspection. She mentally scrambles, desperately trying to figure out what she should do to protect Tatsumi. She realizes that the dark bite marks are still clearly visible on Tatsumi's body, which will surely condemn him. She panics, knowing the crowd will never accept the truth about how her intimate connection prevented his monstrous transformation. As she frantically wonders what to do, a voice suddenly cuts through the tension, declaring them both completely fine. Yura confidently steps forward, claiming he personally checked their bodies before they arrived. The crowd is taken aback as Yura firmly states they already showed him their unbitten bodies. Mikoto turns in sheer disbelief, calling out his name. Stunned by the unexpected rescue, she whispers his name, scarcely believing he is truly there. Overwhelmed with relief, she confirms to herself that this is really Yura. The genuine warmth and familiarity of the original Yura brings her immense comfort. Tears spring to her eyes as she loudly calls out to him. She tearfully admits she has been desperately looking for him this entire time. Clinging to him, she repeatedly asks if this is real and not just a beautiful dream. Crying into his chest, she expresses her profound relief that he is finally safe. She quickly transitions her focus, urgently asking if their grandfather is also okay. Yura reassures her that although he suffered minor injuries and cannot move easily, their grandfather is currently in a safe location. Immensely relieved that her grandfather is truly alive, she listens as Yura turns his attention back to her. Yura subtly shifts his gaze, curiously asking about the handsome stranger standing beside her. Flustered, Mikoto frantically tries to explain, accidentally starting to call Tatsumi a pervert before formally introducing him as a self-defense force member who helped her. She nervously introduces her brother to Tatsumi, entirely unsure of how much of their complex story she should reveal. The two men lock eyes, silently sizing each other up amidst the lingering tension. Tatsumi breaks the silence, coldly stating they lack the time for slow, formal introductions. Yura reveals a divine tool he brought, noting it proved more useful than expected, and orders them to return to the boat. He explains there is a small ship moving on the west side of the harbor that they can use. Yura decisively plans for them to board the ship together and head straight to Himen Island. He grimly warns that while Himen Island is in better shape than the mainland, it still suffered heavy damage from the disaster. Acknowledging their previous connection on the boat, Mikoto nervously realizes their deeply profound mystical bond changed absolutely everything. The small vessel gently rocks upon the dark ocean waves as they silently process their terrifying ordeal together. The incredibly tense atmosphere lingers heavily as the frightened group continues navigating through the terrifying apocalyptic nightmare. Yura calmly interrupts the heavily panicked crowd, intelligently suggesting alternative testing methods exist beyond invasive physical examinations. He confidently explains that infected individuals consistently develop a rapidly spiking fever directly during their horrific monstrous transformation. Reminding them of the previous tragic incident, he confidently assures everyone this highly efficient method leaves nothing overlooked. Revealing his incredibly thorough preparation, Yura produces several digital thermometers he cleverly gathered alongside the critical emergency supplies. The deeply relieved survivors praise his brilliant foresight, eagerly agreeing to systematically scan all incoming refugees moving forward. Deeply grateful for the sudden rescue, Mikoto realizes Yura miraculously saved them without seeing the massive soldiers' injuries. The relieved group politely directs the highly capable military soldier to help organize their rapidly dwindling food supplies. Leading her safely away from the chaotic crowd, Yura gently calls out to his deeply overwhelmed younger sister. He firmly guides her completely away from the tense gathering, successfully ensuring they finally share a private moment. Glancing back nervously, Mikoto deeply hopes the heavily burdened military soldier can effectively manage the suspicious survivors alone. Delivering incredibly crushing news, Yura sorrowfully reveals that their elder uncle tragically perished during the violent initial collapse. He grimly explains their stubborn grandfather had already evacuated the island and was swiftly transported to a medical facility. Reassuring her highly frantic questions, he firmly confirms their grandfather merely suffered easily treatable fractures and a fever. Mikoto highly desperately questions exactly why their incredibly stubborn grandfather secretly traveled to the completely dangerous mainland then. Shockingly realizing the entire truth, she understands her grandfather heroically hid her before entirely collapsing behind the school. Her highly disjointed memories finally align, completely confirming his terrifying warning about the deadly immortal princess was real. She heavily struggles to deeply decipher the entirely cryptic and highly dangerous message her stubborn grandfather left behind. A completely chilling dread abruptly washes over her trembling body as she connects the ancient myth to reality. Entirely refusing any offered food, She incredibly stubbornly rejects her brother's highly gentle attempts to force her rest. Quickly settling beside the sterile medical cot, she fiercely vows to remain entirely vigilant until their grandfather finally awakens. Completely acknowledging her entirely unyielding determination, Yora softly accepts her rigid decision to maintain the exhausting bedside vigil. He calmly promises to carefully bring her essential supplies while she silently begs the unconscious elder for answers. Intensely staring at the peacefully resting old man, she desperately prays for him to miraculously regain consciousness immediately. Carefully analyzing the highly grim timeline, Tatsumi precisely calculates the exact duration their highly mystical healing bond lasts. He entirely concludes they must frequently renew their deeply intense physical connection to prevent his utterly horrific monstrous transformation. Briefly pausing his highly tactical analysis, Tatsumi deeply questions the unusually intense and highly protective sibling familial bond. A highly strange sense of deeply uneasy suspicion heavily clouds his focused mind as he reviews their close interactions. He immediately and aggressively brushes off his sudden jealousy just as Yora confidently approaches him in the dark corridor. The two incredibly capable men instantly lock eyes, completely and silently judging each other in the dim emergency lighting. Maintaining an entirely perfectly polite facade, Yora highly firmly requests a completely private conversation with the hardened military man. Suddenly, the entire ruined building groans incredibly loudly as a highly violent tremor forcefully shakes the unstable concrete foundations. The entirely violent shaking abruptly and completely jolts Mikoto awake from her highly exhausted and deeply restless troubled slumber. Yora incredibly quickly reassures her deeply terrified confusion, highly calmly explaining the massive tremor was merely a passing aftershock. The massive rumbling gently fades entirely away, heavily leaving the tense and highly damaged shelter completely silent once again. Instantly realizing his close physical proximity, she completely notes the highly chilling night air rapidly cooling the damaged facility. He highly quickly apologizes for suddenly startling her, incredibly playfully brushing off his highly protective and overbearing bedside manner. Readily providing her completely freshly washed traditional shrine garments, he gently asks if she is finally ready to properly eat. Completely knowing her personal habits perfectly, he generously offers to prepare the highly makeshift showers while the massive shelter sleeps. A highly sudden and completely massive jolt of pure panic entirely overrides her brief moment of absolute familial comfort. Highly frantically checking the accurate time, she deeply and desperately asks exactly where the dangerously infected military soldier vanished. Yora completely and instantly drops his entirely warm smile, highly quickly adopting a chillingly cold and unreadable dark expression. Without a single solitary ounce of any hesitation, he highly bluntly confesses that he strictly ordered the dangerous soldier out. Mikoto entirely freezes in complete and absolute horror, utterly realizing her highly overprotective brother just entirely doomed the infected soldier.